Hi, and welcome to JWI's National Alliance September webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for the first webinar of the 2021-22 season. I'm Ariella Nekritz, who oversees the National Alliance. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please type your questions for the presenters in the Q&A area throughout the webinar. You can also type questions in the chat box and participate in any aspects of engagement through the chat box and share any questions if you're having problems with audio or anything of that nature. We are using automatic closed captioning software, which is why you'll see a live in the corner. To show captions in the bottom of the Zoom window, click the up arrow button next to closed captions and then click on show subtitle. This webinar is being recorded and a recording will be emailed out Monday along with the transcript, resources, and slides. If you're interested in receiving a professional development certificate, make sure to fill out the form linked in the follow-up email. So we'd love to get a sense of who is joining us today. If you're comfortable, please fill out the poll that you'll see on your screen and let us know kind of what profession best represents your role. If you're choosing that other and you want to share with us in the chat what role you play at your organization, we'd love to hear and have a sense of who's in the room. Great, it looks like we have some DV advocates, some social workers, some counselors, educators. Thank you all so much for the critical work you do in your communities and for joining us today. Without further ado, today's webinar is on COVID-19 housing assistance updates for advocates of gender-based violence survivors. Our presenters are Carlo Ng and Renee Williams. Carlo Ng is the Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. She focuses on legal and policy strategies to ensure safe shelter and housing for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Her work includes collaborating with housing providers, survivor advocates, and government agencies to implement the housing protections under the Violence Against Women Act. She further leads NASH's initiatives on immigrant rights and linguistic justice. Carlo has an extensive background in advocating for survivors' housing protections, as well as providing national technical assistance and training on issues impacting the rights of survivors and immigrants in federal housing programs. Renee Williams is the senior attorney at the National Housing Law Project. She focuses on fair housing and equal access to housing issues, including national origin discrimination, housing access for persons with limited English proficiency, nuisance and crime-free housing ordinances, and obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. Renee also leads their initiative focusing on housing rights of domestic violence survivors and the implementation of the Violence Against Women housing protections. Now it's my honor to turn it over to Carlo and Renee.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, and really great to see folks joining the webinar today. There's a lot to discuss, and so I'm going to jump in, and then Carlo will pick it up after I've spoken for a little bit and kicking us off. All right. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to try and, just give folks the information they need and the updates they need to advocate for the housing rights of survivors. So we're going to talk about the federal eviction moratorium. Folks may have seen that in the news. We'll also talk about emergency rental assistance, which is a really important piece of the puzzle of trying to keep folks housed. And within that, we're going to do a quick overview of the Treasury Department's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, also called Ewrap. And then we'll also just talk about a newer program called Emergency Housing Vouchers, which that particular program includes the population of survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and human trafficking. So this is, a new resource that also is available to survivors who need to access safe and affordable housing. And as we're talking today, please put your questions in the chat, and then we'll try to answer them. And we're going to set aside some time for Q&A. So first, I'm going to talk about eviction moratoriums and emergency rental assistance. So a lot of folks have probably seen coverage of the CDC federal eviction moratorium in the news. And as a lot of folks know, back in late August, the US Supreme Court invalidated the federal eviction moratorium that had been issued by the Centers for Disease Control, and was really keeping folks in their homes during this pandemic. And so, without that protection, we're now sort of turning to a new world where, folks who have, because of the pandemic, really a lot of families in the US have fallen behind on rent and are really struggling to stay in their homes. So, what we're going to talk about today is strategies to, and updates about how to keep folks in their homes to the extent possible, and specifically talk about how these changes and what protections apply to survivors. So one really important point to note right off the bat is that states and localities in response have enacted, state level eviction moratoriums. It's not the majority of places, but I think one sort of first step for folks to do is to go to the Eviction Lab webpage, look up where you are and see if there are any ongoing eviction or utility shutoff moratoriums that may apply to folks that you're working with. And so, that list is pretty consistently updated, but, I think that's going to be an important first step. So this is just a snapshot of the Eviction Lab website. And as you can see, what it does is it tries to provide source material for understanding where a particular eviction moratorium may apply. So you can see here, for example, on this chart, and I would say this screen grab is a little bit dated, and so I would definitely rely on the link and the information at that link for the most up-to-date information. The other thing that you can do is think about how you can link survivors to emergency rental assistance. One way is to have the survivor call 211 or give them the 211 website. 211 has been trying to connect folks with housing services. And so this is just a snapshot of the 211 website. So that's one way. The other thing that you can do, and as advocates, one thing that is really important to note, and Carlo and I have been working to get the word out, is that there are billions of dollars of rental assistance that have been made available by various pieces of legislation. That rental assistance is in the process of being distributed. And so if you're working with survivors who are housing insecure, who have a lot of rental debt, this emergency rental assistance is available. And, practically speaking, there have been a lot of challenges in trying to get the rental assistance out in a timely manner. So one thing that, we're telling folks is folks should apply for rental assistance as early as possible, just because, there have been delays in many jurisdictions. I will say, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, there have been measures that the Treasury Department has taken to try and speed up the process of getting rental assistance out. They've made, some changes to guidance for the federal rental assistance program to try and streamline the process of getting rental assistance out. So, aside from 211, another just helpful and really important resource is to visit the compilation of rental assistance programs at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They have this really helpful database, which provides information about both state and local emergency rental assistance programs. And it's a really helpful resource for folks trying to get a sense of what the lay of the land is where they live. And so you can see, this was updated a while ago. Again, these screen grabs are not necessarily the most up to date. And so definitely go to the website to check for the most updated information. But as you can see here, just looking at Alabama, you can see not only the state program, but also the specific county programs as well, and the status of those programs. One thing that my colleague Mariel Block, who is our expert in all things rental assistance, has said is that, if you run across an emergency rental assistance program and say, the program status here or on its website says, we're not taking applications at this time, the application list is closed, check back, because the way that emergency rental assistance funds are being distributed, there are different tranches of money that are being allocated. And so just because a rental assistance program may be out of funds, 1 month, the next month, there may be more money available. So, that this is something that folks are, going to want to check fairly regularly to see what the status is of those programs, if they have, at least for the moment, stop taking applications. So one really important takeaway is just how flexible the emergency rental assistance program is in terms of the range of expenses that the rental assistance program covers. So I just wanted to, and folks definitely can access the slides. And if folks have particular questions, feel free to follow up or put something in the chat. But this is just an overview of the types of expenses that the emergency rental assistance program covers. So for example, the big one, right, is back rent. So rent, including rent at previous addresses, is covered by the emergency rental assistance program. The one big criteria in terms of how far back, it has to be rent that had been incurred during COVID-19. So what we're talking about is rent that was accrued starting in March of 2020 when the federal emergency related to COVID was declared. There are also utilities and utility arrears. Utilities is also a really important part of folks being able to access safe housing. And so the financial assistance also applies to utilities. It can also cover what are called rent bonds in eviction actions. So this is a state-by-state issue, but in certain jurisdictions, folks actually have to put up sort of an advance rent payment if they're facing an eviction. And so Ewrap funds can be used for that to, again, help folks avoid eviction or be able to fight the eviction. There are also other, housing related expenses. One that's really important for survivors, relocation assistance. That's something that Ewrap can be used for, including security deposits. And particularly for survivors who are coming out of relationships where there has been financial, or economic coercion or abuse, being able to use Ewrap funds for security deposits, is really helpful. As well as rental fees, tenant screening fees, all of these fees where, that really provide barriers for folks to be able to access, to be able to relocate or access new housing. Next slide. The other thing that these funds can be used for is a suite of housing stability services. So again, what a particular Ewrap program covers and doesn't cover, that is going to be really up to the state or local program, but this is sort of the range of, of what the particular programs can fund. And as you can see, one of the items is housing services for survivors of domestic violence or human trafficking, landlord-tenant mediation. So to the extent that you have landlords and tenants who might be able to come to some sort of agreement that runs short of eviction, the Ewrap funds can be used there too. Really, the name of the game for a lot of this is really trying to prevent folks from having an eviction action filed against them. And, worst case, getting an eviction judgment against them, because as folks who work with housing insecure folks may know, having an eviction on your record really follows you, right? It really has a lot of downstream consequences that make it really difficult for folks to find housing after the fact. So this is a snapshot of the eligibility requirements for Ewrap. I'm not going to get too specific here because there are actually two tranches of Ewrap funds. And so, but these are the requirements that, and the criteria between the two slightly differ, but these are sort of the big picture eligibility criteria. So one is having experience in economic hardship that's related to COVID. For the second tranche of funds, it's actually a little bit broader, which is during COVID. So there is some sort of economic hardship that has been experienced, due to or during the pandemic. Then, the household member can demonstrate, that they are, at risk of homelessness or of housing instability. And then there's an income threshold as well of 80% of area median income. Importantly, tenants can receive up to 18 months of assistance for Ewrap. So, again, it's a lot of assistance that is possible under Ewrap. But, again, what states and localities are actually offering, a lot of that is going to be determined at the state or local level. So other features of the Ewrap program. So, generally the Ewrap program, the funds are being paid directly to the landlord. What we've seen and heard about across the country is that in some cases, landlords may refuse to apply for the Ewrap funds. And so, tenants can apply and receive the funds separately from the landlord if the landlord refuses to apply. Funds can also be used to pay rent prospectively as well. Those are a limit on that. I believe it's 3 months. Tenants in federally subsidized housing can access Ewrap funds. This is really important. So if you're working with a survivor or client who, has a Section 8 voucher, lives in public housing, lives in some sort of other federally subsidized housing, where the housing subsidy is based on their income, what ends up happening is that, what we've seen is that tenants who are in these programs are being turned away from emergency rental assistance because they live in federally subsidized housing. If they live in federally subsidized housing, they can still receive emergency rental assistance for the portion of the rent that they pay. So the unsubsidized portion of the rent. So, for example, in the voucher program, somebody is paying 30% of their income in rent. So whatever that portion is that they're paying toward rent, that can be assisted by Ewrap. And then just also really important, Ewrap funds are not considered to be income for other public benefits purposes. That's a question that a lot of folks have, or there might be some hesitancy for folks because they're worried about their other benefits. I mentioned that the Treasury Department is really trying to make Ewrap funds, streamline the process so that folks can get the money more quickly. So one important thing is that the Treasury Department has said that tenants can self-attest, self-certify their particular, circumstances, such that, they're not having to go around and, necessarily verify everything up front. So this is an example, various examples of what the Treasury Department has said are places that, are providing forms for self-attestation so that, again, folks can be able to try and get out the funds more quickly, or programs rather can get the funds out more quickly to folks who really need it. So just a couple of things based on, things that we've heard or that have come up. So there are no immigration restrictions for emergency rental assistance funds. Tenants are eligible regardless of their immigration status. So, if folks are seeing that programs, and we keep hearing about this, programs are either requiring proof of immigration status, or more commonly, you see rental assistance programs asking for things that are essentially a proxy for immigration status, like requiring a social security number, or in some places state ID, where you have to have a certain immigration status. We want to hear about that at National Housing Law Project. My contact information is at the end. Really, the name of the game is really to try and get funds out to folks who need it. And so if there are these barriers being put up that, aren't consistent with the law, the law doesn't impose any restrictions on these funds. So again, that's something that NHLP would want to hear about. So please let us know. There's also no requirement that there are written leases to obtain assistance. So, a lot of tenants may have oral leases. There's no written lease requirement in the federal law. Another big issue that we're seeing is that, language access issues. So rental assistance programs that are not accessible to folks who don't speak English, but who are otherwise eligible for the assistance. It's become a real equity issue in terms of access to these funds. Additionally, disability access issues. So for example, if there are not alternative ways for folks to apply for rental assistance who need it, if it's only online, or, it's only, the application process is such that a person can only access the application, in a way that, excludes folks who experience different types of disabilities. Those are problematic and shouldn't be happening, but we hear about these issues. So again, if your program, your state or local program is not, for example, having applications in different languages that are not English, that's a problem. Another thing that we'd want to hear about, so NHLP definitely would want to hear about that. We also, both of our organizations want to hear about particular barriers for survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence because of the way that these programs work, right? And, for example, if a household has to apply, is that creating issues for survivors who may live with a perpetrator, but who may not necessarily want to continue living with that perpetrator? And are there barriers there in terms of survivors being able to access rental assistance? That's another thing that we'd love to hear about. And then finally, if you are working with somebody who is being evicted, the bottom line that we tell folks is to please refer them to an attorney, legal aid as soon as possible, even if there is a state or local moratorium in place. Out here in California, where there are continuing eviction protections, we have definitely seen evasion of both state protections. We've seen in other places, right, when the CDC moratorium is in place, that folks are still being evicted. And so, folks should definitely get legal representation as quickly as possible so that, folks can preserve their rights in terms of being able to defend an eviction. A couple of links for legal aid services. And then just another really important point specifically for survivors. Survivors shouldn't be evicted because of the violence against them. So there are additional eviction protections for survivors that are independent of COVID. So for survivors who live in federally assisted housing, there's the Violence Against Women Act. For women survivors, there is the Federal Fair Housing Act, which protects against sex discrimination. And so certain types of policies or actions that discriminate against survivors can also run afoul of the Fair Housing Act's prohibition on sex discrimination. And then there are a variety of state and local protections for survivors. So for example, lock changes, the ability to get locks changed, the ability to terminate a lease early. And these apply regardless of whether a survivor lives in some sort of subsidized housing. And of course, that's going to be a state and local question. So at NHLP, we have a compilation of the housing protections for survivors state by state. We're in the process of updating that compendium. But if you go to that website, you can get a snapshot of the types of protections that may apply and may protect survivors, to be able to either stay in their homes or to be able to leave a dangerous situation. And with that, I will turn it over to Carlo, who's going to talk about the new emergency housing voucher program.
Thanks so much, Renee. That was all really, really great information, and it was a lot of information. There's a lot of information available out there right now about all these different sources of COVID-related housing assistance. And so I just want to take a moment to see if folks have questions about anything that Renee talked about, because I know it is a lot. And then we're going to give you more information now about the emergency housing vouchers, which is another bucket of rental assistance money that is COVID-related too. So just want to give folks a couple of seconds to see if, I'm not sure if there's a capability for people. It looks like it's a small group of us today. So folks, I'm not sure if people can raise their hands and talk, but if not, you can type it into the Q&A box.
People can raise their hands if they want to talk. So if anyone is interested in asking a question, feel free to click the raise your hand at the bottom.
Okay, so I don't see any hands raised, so I can continue on with emergency housing vouchers. And folks, again, we're a small crowd today, so please feel free to just, raise your hand or type questions into the box, and we'll be sure to address those questions. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about emergency housing vouchers. And we tried to give you a little bit of background so that folks who know very little or nothing about these vouchers have that context. Next slide, please. Thanks, Renee. Oh, I love Renee. Renee and I have been doing this forever. Okay, so the overview for emergency housing vouchers. So many of you may have heard that the American Rescue Plan Act was passed in March of this year. It provided billions and billions of dollars in COVID-related assistance to various folks and entities. And as part of that package, there was $5 billion that was provided for purposes of funding the Emergency Housing Vouchers program. And so these emergency housing vouchers, they are at HUD, so they are administered by HUD, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But they operate essentially very similarly to the tenant-based rental assistance program that you all may have heard of. It's called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It used to be called Section 8 vouchers, so many of you might still refer to it as Section 8 vouchers. And so because colloquially it's still called Section 8 vouchers, you'll hear me talking about these vouchers in terms of Section 8 vouchers. But the emergency housing vouchers, it's based on the Section 8 voucher model. So these vouchers are at HUD and they are administered through public housing agencies. They're also called public housing authorities, which, as many of you know who know about Section 8 vouchers, the public housing agencies also administer Section 8 vouchers. And so we'll be referring to the public housing agencies or authorities as PHAs, using that acronym for the rest of the presentation. And so much like the Section 8 vouchers, these emergency housing vouchers, whoever gets them can use these vouchers, and they have to find a unit in the private market in order to use the voucher assistance. So again, very similar to the Section 8 voucher program. Just because you get the voucher assistance, it doesn't mean that's the end of it. You as the participant now have to use that assistance, go out into the market, find a private landlord who will be a part of the voucher program and will take the voucher assistance and work with the housing authority to provide housing for you as the voucher participant. And again, much like the Section 8 voucher program, the emergency housing vouchers are what we call mobile rental subsidy. So that what that means basically is that the assistance moves with the participant or the family or the household who has that assistance. So for example, if a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, they don't feel safe living in the unit that they currently are in because of the violence that's been committed against them, they can actually take that voucher assistance and move to a unit in another place. So say I got my voucher from the Sacramento Housing Authority out here in California, but I no longer feel safe in my unit that is voucher assisted, and I want to move to Boston, Massachusetts, where I have some family and friends and I feel safer living there. I can take my voucher assistance with me so long as the housing authority in Boston, which is called the Boston Housing Authority, will absorb that voucher. So that is a very, very unique aspect to voucher assistance. It's very different from a lot of other kinds of rental assistance that you hear about. That is very much attached to the unit. And so when the tenants leave, that assistance can't move with them, but this is very different. Next slide. Alrighty, so who qualifies for emergency housing vouchers? So this is where some of the unique aspects of the emergency housing voucher program are going to come out. We're going to talk about this very much in contrast to the Section 8 voucher program. So for one thing, there are very specific eligibility categories for emergency housing vouchers. And again, that's different from the Section 8 program, where generally, as long as folks qualify income-wise, lots of folks can apply for the Section 8 program with some, exceptions. But generally speaking, anyone can apply so long as you income qualify. But for emergency housing vouchers, it's very different. The American Rescue Plan Act told us that there are only certain individuals and families who are eligible for this assistance. And essentially, it's these four categories of folks. It's folks who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, or human trafficking. I will tell you that Congress, when they passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which included these emergency housing vouchers, they did provide some leeway for localities to provide more flexible assistance for survivors. So some folks have mentioned that the fleeing or attempting to flee language can be very problematic for survivors who may not be in immediate physical danger or feel like they're in immediate physical danger, but they are still very much still dealing with the trauma that has that they have because of the violence that has occurred. And so they might not be technically fleeing or attempting to flee, but they do not feel safe. They still do not feel safe. And because of that, they might need this assistance. And that is okay. There have been some housing providers that have said, okay, you might not be fleeing or attempting to flee, but you don't feel safe and you're still a survivor. And so you qualify. And we'll talk about some examples related to that during the presentation. Another category of folks who qualify for the emergency housing vouchers are folks experiencing homelessness, folks at risk of experiencing homelessness. And then there's this new fourth category that I think most people aren't familiar with. And quite frankly, I think HUD and other folks are still trying to figure out what it means, but it's people who are recently homeless, and by providing the voucher assistance, the voucher assistance would prevent the individual or family from homelessness or prevent them from having a high risk of housing instability. So as you can see, even though survivors kind of have their own category, survivors may also fit into any of the other categories, right? Folks that are experiencing homelessness, at risk of experiencing homelessness, etc. Next slide, please. There are other eligibility requirements because, again, the emergency housing voucher program is very much modeled after the Section 8 voucher program. So some of the Section 8 voucher programs, the requirements related to that will carry on into the emergency housing voucher program, but there are some very, very distinct and real exceptions, right? We're starting to get into that, but I also want to kind of compare, what's similar with the Section 8 voucher program and what's different. So for the first category, income qualifications, they are similar. So the family or individual, they have to be making, their income has to be 50% area median income or less. So it cannot be higher than 50% of whatever the median income is in the locality. So that is the same. However, in the Section 8 voucher program, there are some targeting requirements, which basically means that HUD has some regulatory requirements that essentially require housing authorities to provide at least 75% of the vouchers that they have to extremely low income families, right? To really help the poorest folks access voucher assistance so that they can avoid homelessness. So those targeting requirements don't apply to the emergency housing voucher program. Those are out. So really what we're focusing on is just the kind of basic income eligibility qualification, which is 50% or less of area median income. Also really different about this program is that there are only 2 mandatory prohibitions about criminal history. So a big part of the emergency housing voucher program is that HUD has recognized that for folks who fall into one of the 4 categories that we previously mentioned, they're going to have a lot of obstacles and barriers. These folks have historically been folks who have a lot of trouble accessing housing and maintaining housing. These folks may very well have a criminal history. And so they're really trying to make the emergency housing voucher program as low barrier as possible and as accessible as possible, given some of the statutory requirements. So what they have said is the only 2 mandatory prohibitions that housing authorities can have about criminal history are if someone is convicted of manufacturing or producing methamphetamine in federally assisted housing. So it is a conviction. Just because someone has said that you did it, or they've alleged, or you've been, any kind of thing that is not a conviction, this requirement would not apply to the person. The second mandatory prohibition is if someone has been subject to a lifetime registration requirement under state sex offender registration program. So again, it has to be a lifetime registration requirement under a state sex offender registration program. So those two are the only two mandatory ones. If you are helping a survivor or anyone else access emergency housing vouchers, and the housing provider is saying, well, you can't because of this criminal history, because they were arrested, because of violence that was committed in the home, well, those are all permissive and they are not mandatory. And so in order for a housing provider to deny someone this kind of voucher assistance, they would really need to look at other information. So is there any sort of have they been part of, is there anything, any kind of mitigating circumstances that would explain why an applicant might have this kind of record? So for purposes of a survivor, it might be domestic violence. If they're arrested because of domestic violence that happened in the home, and the police, part of their policies, they just arrest everybody because of domestic violence if they can't sort out what's going on, then the housing authority and other housing providers, they really have to look into why it is that they cannot access the voucher assistance. And, as Renee mentioned before, survivors cannot be denied assistance because of violence committed against them. And so that cannot, domestic violence or sexual assault cannot be a reason why someone is denied voucher assistance. There are also immigration status requirements. We get this question a lot, which is why we specifically put it here as something we want to go over. So there are immigration status requirements, and that's in large part because the Section 8 voucher program has immigration status requirements. Next slide, please. And so what are those immigration status requirements for the emergency housing voucher program? So there has to be, there are US citizen immigration status requirements, and they are the same as in the Section 8 voucher program. So what that means is at least one household member has to be a US citizen or US national, or be a quote unquote eligible immigrant. And we'll define what quote unquote eligible immigrant is on the next slide. But it has to be at least one person. So that means that if you're in a family of 3 or 4 or 5, and the rest of the folks don't qualify, or you're in a mixed status family where there are folks with different kinds of citizenship and immigration statuses, that's okay, as long as at least one person qualifies. So you often see situations where you have a parent and a child, right? It's an adult parent and a minor child. And it could be that the minor child is the US citizen. Usually it's a US citizen, but it could also be an eligible immigrant. And again, we'll show you what eligible immigrant means on the next slide. And the minor child is that, and that's okay. That's okay if it's the only person that qualifies is the minor child. And what will happen is the mixed status family will receive prorated voucher assistance. So the assistance will take into account that there are other folks in the households who don't qualify for the assistance because of immigration status. And the assistance will essentially be decreased because of that. Next slide. So here are the categories of eligible immigrants. So again, folks who qualify for the emergency housing voucher assistance, as well as Section 8 voucher assistance, are US citizens or nationals, and these folks. So they can be lawful permanent residents, folks with green cards, VAWA petitioners, and VAWA petitioners, keep in mind, so these are folks who are applying independently for their immigration status because of domestic violence that has happened to them. They came in the country because of an immigration status that their spouse had, but because of domestic violence, they are now separated, and now they're petitioning for their own independent immigration status because of domestic violence. So they actually qualify as soon as they apply for the VAWA self-petition, up until there is an actual denial of the VAWA self-petition by USCIS. And even then, if the survivor then decides to appeal that denial, the survivor continues to be eligible for the voucher assistance through the appeals process until there's a final determination by USCIS about that VAWA self-petition status. Included in eligible immigrants are asylees and refugees, parolees, people who've been granted withholding of removal or withholding of deportation, qualified victims of human trafficking, folks who have granted admission for other public interest reasons. Then there are the folks who live in the US COFA nations, so Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. And then immigrants who have been admitted for lawful temporary residence under the Immigrant Reform and Control Act of 1986. So we have a completely different training that is an hour long that's just focused on immigration requirements in the Voucher Assistance Program. We're happy to share that resource with you if folks have questions. I know folks tend to have a lot of questions about this, and it's actually one of the most probably confusing areas because of all the different immigration statuses. So please feel free to, ask us questions. We can also share resources. Next slide. Okay, so continuing on about what is different about emergency housing vouchers. And again, it's in comparison to the Section 8 voucher program. So another aspect of that is really, really different is that HUD has required that for public housing agencies that have been given these emergency housing vouchers, they have to partner with continuums of care and other referral agencies. So these other partner referral agencies could be homeless service providers and or victim service provider organizations. And that includes domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, because again, these are the folks that are being served by the emergency housing vouchers. And so these folks can all be referral partners. For folks who are not familiar with continuums of care are funded by HUD. They're usually regional or local planning bodies that coordinate housing and services funding for homeless families and individuals. So in your locality, there could be a statewide one, if you're in a sort of a smaller state, like Delaware has a statewide one, or you could be in a really big state like California where we're at, and different cities or different regions will have their own continuums of care where they receive homeless funding from HUD to provide a series of different kinds of services to homeless families and individuals to really help them get out of homeless and maintain the housing that they receive. And so what HUD has said is that these continuums of care and the homeless services partners and the victim service provider partners, they all determine the initial eligibility for people who apply for emergency housing vouchers. So what that means is for folks who want to apply for these vouchers, they are going to have to go to a continuum of care or to these other referral partners. They don't go to the housing authority. So again, that's really, really different. It's a really important distinction because we're so familiar, right, with people wanting Section 8 vouchers or public housing, and they know they got to go to the public housing agency, right? That's where they go to apply. They talk to a program person there. They fill out paperwork, provide documentation, and then they get on a waiting list. Here, it is not true. You have to go to the right continuum of care and the referral partners. And we'll talk about how you can do that. But that's really important distinction is you got to apply through these continuums of care, other referral partners. And so these relationships, that we're talking about, these referral relationships where the continuums of care are referring, these other agencies are referring, all these relationships with the housing agency, they all have to be memorialized in a memorandum of understanding. And these memorandums of understanding, these contracts basically can be revised. HUD has said these are living documents. If the needs change regarding the voucher assistance, if there are more people who want to be referral partners, these documents can be edited and they can be revised to reflect what the ongoing need is to really get these vouchers out the door to the right people. And also really important is that HUD has mentioned, in addition, for using these vouchers for purposes of new admission. So people who have never had a voucher, they might not even be in a federally subsidized program, so they're new to the program. They are obviously eligible for this program. But what HUD has also said is that if there are families that are already working with public housing agencies, like, so for example, if there are survivors in public housing, if there are survivors in other kinds of assisted housing, that they can use these vouchers for purposes of an emergency transfer under the Violence Against Women Act. So say it's a survivor living in public housing, something has happened, they don't feel safe because of the violence they've experienced, they need to move to they want to move to another unit or get some other form of assistance that'll get them the safety move they need. HUD has said that housing authorities can use these vouchers for purposes of the safety move. So public housing, a survivor in public housing can apply for one of these emergency housing vouchers, get it, and then use that voucher to then move, which is great because, like we said before, vouchers are a mobile form of assistance, right? They move with the tenant. And so that is kind of an ideal situation for a survivor who, you know, because for safety reasons might have to move multiple times. And so that inherent flexibility in the assistance really, really can be helpful. Next slide. Okay, another aspect of the housing vouchers that is really different, the emergency ones, is that there is this amount, $3,500 in services fee that is given per voucher for every voucher that's given out to help folks who get these vouchers access housing. So one of the major issues that we all know about is that it is really, really hard, even if you get a voucher, say a Section 8 voucher, and certainly this kind of voucher, just because you have that voucher assistance, it doesn't mean that you'll be able to use it. Because one of the biggest challenges that we know is that leasing up is just as hard as getting the voucher itself. And very, very unfortunately, we see many, many families lose their voucher assistance because they cannot use their voucher in the private market. Find a unit where a private landlord will say, okay, I will take your voucher, I will be part of the program within the given amount of time that they have. And so a lot of folks just lose their voucher after having waited years for the voucher. They just lose it, and that is really, really difficult for everybody. And so what HUD has said is, look, because we know that, and we really, really want to make sure that these folks who really need housing assistance are able to actually use it in a real way, we're going to attach $3,500 to every voucher to be used towards housing search assistance. So whatever the family needs, whether it's transportation, to have meetings, to go look at units for purposes of leasing up, or if they're application fees, if folks need, you know, here are the other sort of things that you can use the money for. If folks need money for security deposits, utility deposits, rental application fees, holding fees, incentives for landlords. You know, housing authorities could also use the money towards really giving landlords a financial incentive to join the voucher program that might make them more likely to join it. Then that could be great. And then there are other eligible uses like moving expenses, renter's insurance. And so as you kind of look at this and work with, you know, the continuums of care or the housing authorities to help survivors access these vouchers, you know, keep in mind that there is this housing search assistance, and a lot of the eligible uses can be incredibly helpful for survivors, right? Because, you know, things like application fees, anything that would require additional money, additional time, you know, what can really serve as a barrier. And so here is a certain amount of money that is being offered to help survivors and other folks really access the voucher assistance. Next slide. I've mentioned it before, but HUD has really emphasized that these emergency vouchers have to be as low barrier as possible. And so one of the other issues is making sure that the documentation related to accessing the vouchers is as low barrier as possible. And I say as possible because I'm not saying that the requirements and all this stuff are actually truly low barrier the way that I think that we would all wish that it were low barrier. There are some laws, you know, other issues related to policy that are preventing really the program from being truly low barrier, because truly low barrier would be no documentation, right? No documentation, next to no requirements about who's eligible. But, you know, HUD is working hard towards making it as low barrier as they possibly can. So one of the issues is just keeping it to very low documentation. There is a form that HUD has provided for folks who are the referral partners, so the continuums of care and the victim services provider. They can use this form when they're working with survivors to basically say, yes, these folks qualify because of their status as a survivor. And so as you can see, it's very minimal information. You essentially just provide the name and you check box. And on the next slide, there's actually an example of a continuum of care in Los Angeles. So it's a very, very big continuum of care. We worked with them extensively. They actually have close to 7,000 emergency vouchers that they are administering in the county, with between 13 different public housing authorities. And so they're all working together and they're all using the same forms, making sure that things are consistent. And so here is the form that they're using when they are serving survivors who want to apply for the emergency voucher assistance. And so you'll see it's a very short form, intentionally so, that asks very minimal information. You know, it's the name, what public housing agency they are applying to, and then there's a checkbox about, you know, the status of their survivorship, like what kind of survivor, and then it's signature. It's all it is. You know, it doesn't ask about, you know, well, what happened to you? What are the details? When did it happen? And it's intentionally designed to be as low barriers possible, respecting the fact that survivors want to share as little information about what happened to them, because it can be very re-traumatizing for survivors. Next slide. Here's a slide from HUD. So on June 10th of this year, HUD awarded 70,000 emergency vouchers to 626 public housing authorities. And just to give you a little bit of context, there are about 3,300 housing authorities in the country. It's a lot of housing authorities, over 3,000 housing authorities. And so 626 is actually a very small subset of 3,300, even though 600 sounds like a big number. And so what that indicates is that most housing authorities in the country will not be administering emergency vouchers. So so I would not just sort of go to your local housing authority if you happen to be working with housing authorities and ask them, because there's a good chance that they might not know, you know, what these vouchers are, and they might not know who actually has these vouchers. And so we'll show you how to actually figure out who has these vouchers and then connect with the continuum of care that has these vouchers. And so part of what's here is that HUD is showing that there's a lot of geographic diversity in terms of these 600 or so housing authorities that have these vouchers. So you see, they're basically, you know, kind of sprinkled around everywhere in the country. There's probably some big gaps in the Midwest, but, you know, generally speaking, this is much more geographically diverse than sort of other kind of programs that HUD has had. Next slide. This gives you a sense of the memorandums or the contracts that have been in place. So essentially, it looks like most of the housing authorities have contracts in place so these are the contracts where the continuums of care and the other referral partners that include victim service providers have with the housing authority to make sure that, you know, the roles and responsibilities related to referrals and other services are all memorialized and they're being executed. So it looks like most of them are. HUD said a couple of weeks ago that there are 7 that they're not sure whether or not these housing authorities will be able to administer the emergency housing vouchers. Unfortunately, they are all in rural areas, and the main issue for these housing authorities is really capacity. They just don't have the staffing to really be able to administer these vouchers. And so there's a good chance that these 7 housing authorities are going to be giving back their emergency vouchers. And then what HUD will do is they will reallocate the vouchers so that other housing authorities that can take on the vouchers can actually administer them. Next slide. All right, so how to apply. Again, households can apply for the emergency vouchers. They have to go to continuums of care or other referral partners or partnering agencies. And this can include victim service providers. Folks cannot apply for these vouchers through housing authorities. Again, this is very different from the Section 8 program. If you don't know which local continuum of care is accepting these emergency voucher applications, then this is what we recommend. We recommend that you call the local housing authorities that have been allocated these emergency vouchers and get contact information for the local continuums of care or other referral agencies that are taking the emergency voucher applications. And so we'll walk through how to do that step by step in the subsequent slides. But remember, there are no residency preferences for these vouchers. So what does that mean? Typically with the Section 8 program, if you call a housing authority, most housing authorities will say, okay, well, do you live or work in our locality or in the city that we operate? And if you don't, that will automatically X out a whole bunch of people because a lot of housing authorities have what are called residency preferences, which are basically preferences for applicants to either live or work in the jurisdiction that the housing authority is in. And if you don't have that preference, you kind of go further down onto the bottom of the wait list versus if you do, you get 1 or 2 points that'll bump you up a bit. And that can make a huge difference if you're thinking about a waiting list that could easily be 6 or 7 years long. But here for this program, there's no residency preference. So a person could apply for an emergency voucher in another state if they wanted to. I mean, of course, they would have to use the voucher sort of in that vicinity, but you know, there's really no residency preference. So if you want to apply for several, you know, vouchers from several different housing authorities, that's fine, you know, and there would be no requirement to live or work there. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to walk you step by step because we get this question a lot. And it's a very basic question, right? Like, where do we go to apply for an emergency housing voucher? But there actually is not good basic information from HUD about how to do that. So we're going to walk you through how to do that. So first of all, you got to find the housing authorities that have been awarded these emergency vouchers. Again, it's only 626 out of the 3,300. So you got to narrow that down and figure out who are these housing authorities. So you go to this website, hud.gov/EHV, and you go to this link that we circled here. It's called a list of EHV awardees. Those are the public housing agencies that have been given the vouchers. You click on that. Next slide, please. And what you'll get is an Excel spreadsheet that you can sort. And so we did a training for North Carolina about a month ago. And so this is why there's a snapshot of North Carolina. But say I'm in North Carolina and I want to know which housing authorities in North Carolina got these vouchers. And so this spreadsheet tells me after I sort by state, I see, okay, all the North Carolina ones are together, NC. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it looks like there are a good amount going to the North Carolina Commission on Indian Affairs. Okay, and oh, and Raleigh. Hey, I'm in Raleigh. Okay, they got 138, so that's a lot. All right, so now I want to know, how do I get in touch with the Raleigh Housing Authority? Because I'm in Raleigh and I want more information about that. And unfortunately, this spreadsheet doesn't give you contact information. So you have to do another step to find the contact information. Next slide, please. So to get the contact information of the Public Housing Authority, you go back to hud.gov/EHV and you go to this link that we circled in purple where it says find your local public housing agency. Okie doke. We'll click on that. Next slide, please. And oh my goodness, there is a map and there's this nice drop down menu. And so you have two options. You can either, again, I'm in North Carolina, I need to find my information about the Raleigh Housing Authority. So you can either click on North Carolina and then click on go to this page, or you can just go to the map and you find your state, which I circled here, it's North Carolina, and you click on your little state. In both places, it'll get you to the same place, which is, next slide, another really long resource document. So essentially what it'll do is it'll pull up all of the housing authorities in North Carolina or in whatever state you click on and provide the contact information of every single housing authority in that state. And so then your job, if you're looking for a very specific housing authority or authorities, is to find in that long document that particular one. And what I did a word search, like you can do a keyword search, or you can actually just scroll if you're just generally curious. And I just searched for Raleigh and I found it. It's this one, and that's the contact information. So you can call or you can email to get more information. And then once you do, next slide, please. That's not the end of it. There are more steps. Once you do call them, because again, you cannot apply for these vouchers, right, through the housing authorities. You have to go through the continuums of care or other referral agencies. And so what you got to do is when you finally get someone on the phone to say, okay, well, who's the continuum of care? Who's the victim service provider that we need to talk to connect survivors to these vouchers? And then hopefully they will have information, but sometimes you might get a hold of a program person that doesn't know. And you might be referred to someone else within the housing authority. And sometimes you might not get a response. And that has actually happened quite a bit with housing authorities not responding, continuums of care not responding, other folks not responding. And if that happens, HUD has said, contact us. Contact us. This is the email address. We've actually used this email address quite a few times, and they actually respond in a timely way for HUD, so within a couple of days, you'll get some kind of response, which is very helpful. So I would definitely recommend that if you experience any sort of blockages with getting a hold of people because you're helping someone to apply, to definitely go to that email address and email them. And definitely check websites of continuums of care too. So there are quite a few continuums of care that have actually started like online portals to get people connected with the emergency vouchers. Next slide. Here's an example of in Los Angeles. Again, because we've done so much work with Los Angeles, a lot of my examples are from Los Angeles. But I totally recognize that some continuums of care, especially the smaller ones, they might not have the capability to keep their websites constantly up to date. But here's a really good example in Los Angeles of a really, really big continuum of care that has updated their website to provide information about these emergency vouchers, about eligibility, how you apply, et cetera. Next slide. And one thing I wanted to emphasize is that you might remember, again, this was the beginning of my presentation, we've thrown a lot of information at you, but remember when I mentioned the issue about fleeing or attempting to flee, and that's caused some issues on the ground about, well, what if I'm a survivor that I don't feel physically in danger, but I just need to get access to voucher assistance because of the trauma I've experienced. Can I just be eligible because I'm a survivor? And I said that locally, there is some flexibility for local continuums of care to really expand that eligibility pot. So here in Los Angeles, you see that's exactly what they did. They said, you could be a survivor who's fleeing or attempting to flee, or you could just be a survivor. And that's fine. If you need an emergency transfer, if you need whatever it is you need, you can just qualify. And so here you see some language about that to really spell out that survivors period qualify for these vouchers. And that's very, very helpful.
And Carlo, yeah, no, we got a question on this fleeing issue earlier while you were talking, and whether or not there was like a time requirement or things like that. And there's no time requirement related to fleeing, but this is also another advocacy example that you can use. And actually, we've provided technical assistance to advocates in other places who have used the Los Angeles example or have found the Los Angeles example to be helpful. So, definitely look at this Los Angeles example as indicative of the flexibility that Carlo mentioned. I don't know if you want to say anything else about fleeing, Carlo. I just wanted to pop in since we got a question about that.
No, I mean, I think that if you're experiencing obstacles because the continuum of care or maybe another referral agency is saying, well, they're not fleeing or attempting to flee, there's definitely room for advocacy because HUD does not actually have a definition of this. And so it's very, very much up to interpretation. And there's some legal authority that supports that localities can expand what that means, and that it could actually just mean the survivor doesn't feel safe, and that is part of fleeing or attempting to flee. So because of that built-in flexibility, and again, the entire program is premised on enhancing access, low barrier, and making sure that the people who need this assistance are served, that utilize that in your advocacy and keep that in mind. I saw that there was a question. We're at the end, by the way, so this is why we're starting to entertain some questions. I think the next slide is our contact information. And I should note that today is actually my last day at Nash. So maybe what you should do is actually contact Renee. If you have questions after today. Renee is amazing. I've worked with her for, gosh, it's almost like 8-9 years now. She's a wealth of information, and so she can definitely help you out. Are there some other questions, Renee, that we should address? I saw a question about the form. Like, is there some confusion about the form? Should we talk about that?
Yeah, I think, just in terms of, the certification form and, where does that go? Where does that fit in the process? I mentioned that it goes to the COC, but I don't know if you want to also talk about just the role of victim service providers as referrals, and they might actually be the folks with that form too.
Yeah, I mean, it's confusing, right? Because HUD, in their attempt to really make this emergency voucher program as flexible as possible, they've really changed a lot of things that for some of us who've been are used to certain federal housing programs like Section 8, it's really confusing. And so these partnerships with continuums of care and other referral agencies being the partnering agencies that accept the applications, that is like, we're still kind of wrapping our heads around like, okay, what does that look like? What does that mean? You know, and to what extent do these COCs, you know, screen for eligibility? Is it just the first 4 categories? Because we're hearing that some continuums of care are doing more than that, right? Like we're looking into like sort of other eligibility issues. They're collecting the documentation for the applicants, making it sort of easier and more streamlined for the housing authority, so that by the time it gets to the housing authority, there's like a complete package that already has been, you know, not assessed completely, but, you know, it's been kind of compiled and looked through by another entity, so it's easier. And so the form that I showed, and when I was talking about it, I was thinking, gosh, this is going to be confusing. But that form is actually for, thank you for scrolling back, Renee. This form is not for folks who are assisting a survivor to apply. This form is used by the folks who are doing the referrals. So it's either going to be used by the continuum of care or any of the other partnering agencies that are going to do the referrals. So it could be a victim service provider in your community. If there's a victim service provider that has entered into, you know, one of those contracts, the memorandums of understanding with the housing authority and the continuum of care, saying, hey, yes, we will be one of the entities that will accept applications for survivors and other folks. And this is the kind of form we're going to use. So HUD has basically said, here's a sample of a form that you can use as a referral agency, but you wouldn't take this form and go with the survivor to help them apply. You know, the form would be provided to you if you're helping a survivor apply by a continuum of care or another referral agency. I hope that makes sense. But what you could do, right, is if you go to the next slide. So like I said, like in Los Angeles, right, like they have all of their emergency voucher information online. And so here is the form that they provided for you, that where they say, okay, as a referral agency, this is the form we're going to use. You know, all of the referral agencies, the continuums of care, they're all using this form. And so because this is the exact form that we know they're using in the LA COC, you can print out this form, the actual form, and then say, and fill out as much as you can and bring this to the continuum of care or to the other referral agency partners and say, here, I'm helping a survivor apply. What other information do you need?
And folks, please feel free to include more questions. One other thing, you know, Carlo, that you know, that we can also just quickly highlight as well is that, not to add more confusion into this, but, you know, we've been saying you apply to the COC, you apply to the COC. The one exception is if you're working with a survivor who already lives in like public housing, for example, is served by a particular housing authority and they need an emergency transfer. So emergency housing vouchers can also be used in that context, and only in that narrow circumstance is that process really determined by the housing authority. Every other time it is going to have to go through a continuum of care, which then makes the referral back to the housing authority. So I just wanted to mention that as well, since we had a little bit of extra time.
Are there any other questions? Again, you know, this is a lot of information. So even if you have super nuanced questions or clarification questions, please feel free to type them and raise your hand too.
Well, as I'm not seeing any questions coming in the chat or the Q&A, and this is a rich topic and we could continue this important dialogue in respecting everyone's time, I think we can go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, I really want to thank Carlo and Renee and the National Alliance for Safe Housing and the National Housing Law Project for lending your expertise and knowledge to our alliance and sharing today's presentation. This was so informative and so valuable, and thank you both so much for your commitment to this work work and for making this information so accessible. Thank you all for joining us and taking the time to learn more. As I shared at the beginning of this webinar, there will be a recording emailed out to everyone on Monday. So listen again and be sure to share with your colleagues. Additionally, it will include a form to request a professional development certificate. So if you need that for your workplace, you'll be able to request that, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.